Hey everybody. Something I found rather interesting concerning this accident of this DC-4 on April 23rd of 2024 are other DC-4 accidents. I had not planned on doing a video on this because it's obviously covered a lot better than I can cover by other folks. And Juan Brown's got a great video up on it, so I would encourage you to watch that if you want to see the details of the accident. The other accidents of DC-4s are very, very interesting to me. And just being the kind of the nerd that I am, I will look into these other accidents just out of curiosity in a lot of different cases. And I found this to be something I think that you all would be interested in. So briefly on this particular accident, the synopsis is they had an issue with the number one engine, apparently an engine fire. The engine exploded on return to the airport, causing a catastrophic loss of control. And when we look at other accidents, so I'm just going to kind of go back here and just go over, there's 5 of these that I think you'll find interesting. So how do they relate? In January of 2007, so 2007, there was another DC-4. And this airplane, let me just read the synopsis to you real briefly. So, departing out of Fairbanks, carrying 3,000 gallons of heating fuel. En route, the number 2 engine started running rough. The pilot shut it down to returned to Fairbanks. During the shutdown procedure, the engine caught fire. The fire extinguishing system was activated. The crew attempted to divert, but a forced gear-up landing had to be carried out in the tundra. The left wing was consumed by fire. So the probable cause, the failure of an engine cylinder during cruise flight, which resulted in an in-flight fire and subsequent emergency gear-up landing. A factor in the accident was the failure of the fire suppression equipment to extinguish the fire. So rather interesting. Picture of that airplane, no picture of the forced landing. And there's a final report on this, but let's just get into this next one. Okay, so now we're going to go to 2006, another DC-4. This airplane departed Norman Wells. 6 minutes later, the crew declared an emergency due to a fire in the number 2 engine. The number 2 engine quit. The crew tried to extinguish the fire by activating the fire bottles. This did not extinguish the fire. They feathered the number 2 propeller, and simultaneously the number 1 propeller feathered. The crew decided to perform an off-field forced landing, but then the engine fire extinguished. They made it back to Norman Wells, where an emergency landing on 2 engines was carried out. The aircraft departed the runway and came to a halt at the edge of the runway. And something interesting here, there was findings as to cause and contributing factors. Airworthiness directive, there was an AD, mandates the replacement of the potentially hazardous fuel line, but the line had not been replaced on this aircraft. Number 2, a fuel leak from the main left inlet line in the engine compartment of this DC-4 caused an in-flight fire that spread into the nacelle and wing. The fuel-fed fire burned for an extended period of time because turning the fuel selector off is not required as part of the primary engine fire checklist. So that's rather interesting. Here's a picture of that. Another couple pictures. Okay, let's go back to the next one. This is in 2004. Another DC-4, C-54. Okay, the crew of the 4-engine airplane started its engines for a positioning flight from a remote mining strip. Following the startup of the engines, an explosion occurred in the left wing area aft of the number 1 engine firewall and number 1 auxiliary fuel tank. Now we know in this latest accident that debris was coming off of the wing after the engine exploded, and in this general area, it just makes you think, right? So I'm not saying anything, I'm just giving you this information that I find interesting. And it says here, the pilot, so let me just back up. The airplane was parked next to the mine's fuel storage tank. The pilot added power on the remaining engines to move away from the storage tank. Within seconds of beginning to move, the number one engine fell off of the burning wing, followed by separation and an aft folding of the outboard end of the left wing. The outboard end of the wing, however, was still attached via control cables. So you can just imagine that happening in flight. Let me let's see here. So each engine is separated from the wing by a firewall. Within the wing, from outboard to inboard, the fuel tank system consists of the number one fuel tank, the left wing auxiliary fuel tank, and the number two fuel tank. Each wet wing type fuel tank contains a submerged electrical boost pump, sump drain valves, and fuel quantity transmitters. So that kind of gives you a layout of what it is. Let me see here. The inspector examined a portion of the upper wing surface that had been blown away from the airplane during the initial explosion. So this is a catastrophic explosion. He noted that the inside of the upper wing surface, normally positioned over the ox tank, was not charred or sooted. A separated portion of the lower wing surface near the auxiliary boost pump was sooted and charred. Their probable cause, a fuel tank explosion in the left wing auxiliary fuel tank, subsequent fuel fire that occurred during engine start for an undetermined reason. And we're going to go back to another one. This is 1996. A DC-4 named Yukon Trader was on a VFR flight from a remote mining strip at Bronson Creek, Canada. A crew of three, at an altitude of 1,500 feet after takeoff, the crew heard a whining noise. They switched inverters, but the problem persisted. Electrical instrument indications in the cockpit then became erratic, and the number two engine began to misfire. Its fire warning light in the cockpit illuminated briefly. The crew carried out the engine fire drill. However, the fire did not extinguish. The captain commenced a right-hand turn to return to the airport and announced to the crew that the number two engine had separated from the wing. The captain applied maximum power to the three remaining engines. However, the aircraft began to lose altitude. Both pilots held the rudder and aileron controls at full right deflection in an attempt to prevent the airplane from yawing or rolling to the left. The aircraft was shaking violently at the time, and the crew members were unable to read any of the engine or flight instruments. At about 50 feet above ground level, just short of the river, the pilots closed the throttles. The aircraft descended rapidly, and the burning left wing struck a tree just as the fuselage contacted the surface of the river. And the three of them escaped the aircraft. But the captain was missing at the time and presumed to have drowned. It says here, causes and contributing factors: the number two engine separated from the airplane as a result of an intense fire in the wing. The loss of the engine rendered the aircraft uncontrollable, and the pilots were forced to land in the river. And then this last one, in 1986... real simple. The aircraft suffered an uncontrollable number three engine fire and ditched in the Pacific Ocean. And just, I would say, the interesting thing about that is obviously catastrophic because the airplane's capable of flying on three engines, as you all know, and it had to ditch. So pretty interesting stuff. I just thought I would share that with you if it's of interest. Just a tragic deal. And so anyway, we'll talk to you all later, and take care.